Welcome to the Jali Podcast. I'm your host, Melyssa Barrett. This podcast is for those who are interested in the conversation around equity, diversity, and inclusion. Each week, I'll be interviewing a guest who has something special to share or is actively part of building solutions in the space. Let's get started. Mike Paciello is the Chief Accessibility Officer at AudioEye Incorporated, where he drives advancements in digital accessibility. He previously founded Webbable TV, delivering insights on disability and accessibility technology, and authored the pioneering book, Web Accessibility for People with Disabilities. Recognized by President Bill Clinton in 1997 for his role in the W3C's Web Accessibility Initiative, Mike has advised the U.S. Access Board and other federal agencies since 1992. An international leader in accessibility and usability, he also founded the Paciello Group, TPG, a leading software accessibility consultancy acquired by Vispero in 2017. All right, I'm excited to have you here today, Michael Paciello. And I know you have done such amazing work in the industry. You're influencing policy and people that probably don't even know what you're doing in the background. So I absolutely love celebrating people who, whether you have received recognition or not, and I know you have, for the work you do. I just want to thank you for all of the work that you're doing in the space.
Thank you. You're too kind, and you're very kind at the same way.
I just want to kick off just by asking you, where did your journey start? How did you decide that you wanted to pursue a career in digital accessibility, or how did this journey begin?
It's a great question. Lots of folks know it, but many folks do not. So I have literally been in this profession of digital accessibility since this is my 40th year, since 1984. And I stumbled into it really. And I think oftentimes for individuals in the community, people with disabilities or in the profession, usually it comes from one or two angles. Most of the time, it's because they've got a family member with a disability and something comes up, something clicks, they're searching for an answer, a solution, what have you. That was not my case. That didn't happen. The reality of it was that I stumbled into it. I was working for a company that doesn't even exist today, but at the time, in the mid-'80s, Digital Equipment Corporation was the second largest computer corporation on the earth next to IBM, right? And I had taken a job as a technical writer. I always wanted to be a writer. I'd always had aspirations towards writing. And just the way my career path went, I ended up with this technical writing job. Not exactly my idea of a writer, but it was interesting. And about a year into my career, so to speak, one of my managers came up to me and said, "Hey, Mike, I've got this little project on the side and just wondered if maybe you could take this off my plate." And basically what the project involved was taking the computer documentation that we produce there at Digital and delivering the hard copy volumes. And when I say volumes, for anyone that's out there that wants to get a description, we're talking 700-800 page books. These are books that are about operating systems back then, which were very complex for the computer systems then. But we're not talking about a little 20-page booklet here. We're talking large volumes. And then at that, oftentimes, volumes of volumes.
Yeah.
And we would take them. The job was to just take the printed version down to Boston, Massachusetts. I worked up in southern New Hampshire at the time, and deliver them to the National Braille Press in Boston. My boss said, I get one or two requests a year for these things, so it's not a big deal. I would really appreciate it. And I'm thinking, hey, this is a nice little piece to add to my resume, and maybe I'll get a bonus out of it or something along those lines. Selfishly centered. The next day, I got a request from the NBP, and I said, great, let me go about see what this is all about. So I grabbed a few volumes of these books that they wanted, drove down to Boston, ended up being introduced to the then director, Bill Reeder of the National Braille Press. And so they were very thankful for the publications. And he said, hey, let me give you a tour. Let me show you how we produce Braille from the printed page. And I thought, sure, why not? And long story short, he showed me the painstaking process of what it took. Now, this is the mid 80s. Back then, basically, there were no electronic versions of files per se. They existed, but per se, they didn't. They just took a printed page, and a person with a Braille typewriter, so to speak, would hand type this all in, and then they would create a master copy, and then they would put it on their Braille presses. It would take them months, sometimes a year or longer, to produce one Braille book.
Wow.
Because 3 pages of Braille, printed Braille, are the equivalent of one regular printed page that a sighted person typically thumbs through. And I'm thinking, this is ridiculous. It's crazy because I'm back in my office and we're producing documentation in minutes, in seconds. Even then, it was all text-based, not a whole lot of graphics, but we were still producing them. Not only that, but at that particular time, I was working with a very early version of a markup language for electronic documents. This was all invented by Charles Goldfarb at IBM, but basically it was the parallel of a publishing editor who would go through a document, mark up that document, a printed page, and say, here's a paragraph, this is a header, this is a bold, this needs to be bolded, this needs to be indented, things like that. So structure on a page. Now that task was being made into an electronic format. That's how markup languages, which are basically the foundation of the web today, came about. So I thought, if I can create an electronic document page for a printer, and back then we were playing with different types of printers, including the very early versions of PostScript, which was the predecessor of PDF. So we all know PDF and Adobe and Acrobat. So this gives you an idea of the timeline there, right?
Yeah.
If I could produce them for those printers, why couldn't I produce them for a Braille printer? Try to make a long story short, I did some research, reached out to some colleagues, not colleagues, but new friends in the field, said, hey, have you ever done this? Ever tried this? And we ended up creating a working group, an international working group made up of folks from Japan, Europe, the US, Australia, and I think in Canada.
Okay.
We got together, launched it at to this day, it's the largest conference on people with disabilities in California. And we created the international standard, publishing standard for producing accessible documentation. So that stumbling in to making documentation accessible to the blind was how my career started, because at the time I was young, was in my 20s, wasn't really sure what I was going to do, what I was going to be when I grew up. This caught my eye. This became my passion. Here I am 50 years later.
That's awesome. What a great story.
Thank you.
So then in terms of, because I know even pulling together a global group like that, what were some of the initial challenges that you guys faced when you were beginning that endeavor and to really advocate for accessibility?
Yeah, so that's another great question. Ironically, the one challenge that we didn't have was languages, right? Internationalization, that everyone had a common language. We all could speak English, even the folks from Europe and Japan particularly. So that worked out well, so we could communicate. We all had, even though this is the 80s, so there's no web then, there was a notion of the internet. The internet was out there, different forms of communicating, electronic email that we could use. So we closed the gap, so to speak, at that level. The challenges were there really weren't any predecessors for us. We had some inklings of Braille itself was already being formed in an electronic format. So one of our committee members at that time was Joe Sullivan, who created and invented the Duxbury Braille translator. So we had an expert there. One of my colleagues that helped me form this group was George Kirscher. George, at that particular time, owned a little company called Computerized Books for the Blind. And so he was already trying to produce books for the blind on discs. Back then, they were the big floppy disks that we had. So he would produce, yeah. So we had that. How are we going to produce this? But beyond the fact that Goldfarb had this, what he called standard generalized markup language, beyond that, we didn't have a whole lot to work with. So we had to come up with, what do the blind need? Or what do individuals who perhaps have visual disabilities other than blindness, what would they need? Say, for example, screen magnification, larger text, pictures, or something that was voice ready, right? What do they need? So it really came down to defining those critical needs of users, collectively asking users, asking publishers what kind of requests that they were getting from the blind and low vision community. Those are some of the bigger challenges. Then I think the other thing was, how do we communicate on a regular basis? How do we meet? Travel wasn't nearly as easy as it is today. We certainly didn't have social networking, video calls, or anything like that at that particular time. So that became a challenge. So we just decided that we would meet at conferences that we all attended anyway. So
Okay.
now we had a common ground, and those became 3 or 4 times a year our meeting places, right? So for doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, it was to get a standards body to back us up, because we were producing a standard, right? A publishing standard. And between the SGML organization and the American Association of Publishers, we got their backing. We were able to produce what's called the ICAD 22. And that's an official publishing standard you can still look up today.
Wow, that's pretty awesome. In this day and age of data, standards bodies are critical in helping people understand how to exchange data, not only for business purposes, but for every purpose.
Right.
And so I think it's awesome that you had some foresight with all of the people that you have from around the world. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I tell you, it's a lot of it really is. People ask me that question. There's a little bit of luck involved there. Sometimes you just stumble into things, and this is something I stumbled into. And then the next thing you know, you're talking to Vince Cerf, guy that helped invent the web, or you're talking to Tim Berners-Lee, or as Cerf invented the internet, Berners-Lee the web, and Goldfarb the SGML language, and just all of the Yuri Rubinsky, who created the first graphical user authoring tool that we're using for SGML and then later for HTML. And I just started to at that time, we're meeting all these heroes of the technology field. Mark Anderson, I knew when he was in college and stumbled into him with the Mosaic browser. You just say, how in the world did I get here, and why me? I still think that to this day.
Wow.
But it's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful
It
thing.
is a wonderful thing. So then I know you just wrote a book on web accessibility for
Right.
people with disabilities. And I know it focuses on web accessibility and usability.
Mhm.
So how did you decide that you wanted to write this book, and how has it influenced the industry?
Yeah, it's another great question. First of all, you should know that book will be 25 years old in next year. So I didn't just write it. It does hold the distinction of it was the first book ever written on that topic. Now, many other books by friends and colleagues in the field have come out year after year, some that I consider much better than what I put together. But I'll tell you a little bit something about me. I keep whiteboard lists of things that I've always wanted to accomplish. And one of the things that I always wanted to accomplish was to actually write a book. And long story short, I came up with this idea of writing a book about web accessibility. I was literally in between jobs at that particular time. I was working as a volunteer at the World Wide Web Consortium on web accessibility. And I had time, and I thought, this is a little window. How about if I write a book? So I approached a few friends in the publishing field, got picked up by a publisher, came up with the title, pull the book together. I wrote that book in 3 months.
Wow. That's
I had all the notes. I had everything. I've been collecting all there. So it was just a matter of organizing the notes, putting them all together, having a good, great editor, which I did, to work with me in terms of the outline, the structure, and how things worked out. And and I pulled the whole thing. At the suffrage of my wife then and my kids, all four of them, I had to take the summer off. And I wrote that in the summer of 1998. Went to publishing in 99, and I think it was officially produced and released in 2000 by CMP Publishers.
That's awesome. What an awesome experience. So then you went on to do all sorts of things with respect to the Web Accessibility Initiative and W3C and all of those things. And I don't have a lot of experience, but I know when I was working in payments technology, there was a lot of focus when we were developing products to make sure that they were appropriately created. And we had a group within our company that specifically focused on W3C and all of the accessibility requirements, which was really helpful for us because we were responsible for bringing products to market, but we don't know everything we're supposed to know. So it was great that we actually had a resource we could go to, and they were very familiar with what needed to be done and what the requirements for those would be. So what I can imagine, and you were recognized by President Clinton for your influence on the industry. So I know you're being humble, but what has some of that influence looked like?
Let me give you just a little bit of background, if I could, about the Web Accessibility Initiative, how that all came about, because I think that's an important part of the story, and of course, of my story, my biography, if you will. It was at that particular time, I was working, like I said, as a volunteer at MIT. I was half working part-time, but most of my focus was trying to look at what the web and accessibility would be about. There were a number of us that were involved at that particular time. But again, there were no standards. Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the web, and who was the director of the W3C at that time, they had obviously close connections to the US federal government and to Europe. And they were able to secure funding that allowed us to create an office that would be a central office. So I worked with folks at the W3C, including Jim Miller, Tim, Daniel Dadier in particular, and we came up with this office. We wrote a business plan for what we would eventually call the Web Accessibility Initiative. And it was through that office that had a couple of key charters. One was just to build awareness. One was get the word out. Here's what needs to be done to make information usable and accessible on the World Wide Web today, right? So that became part of the charter. The other charter that we had was, for all intents and purposes, the W3C is a standards body. It's not like ISO, so the way that we typically understand ISO, but it's certainly a body that produces standards. And so now we were going to produce an official standard and a series of guidelines. And so we had already in place guidelines and standards that were being produced by WGBH and their National Center for Accessible Media out of Boston, the Trace Research Center out of the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Some work that myself, that International Committee of Accessible Document Design, we were working on. So we already had some of these things. It was a matter now of bringing them in, putting them into a home. The Web Accessibility Initiative Office became the home, and then turning them into an official standard. So that's how that all became parcel of what we see today as it carries forth through. We're working on those guidelines are called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and we're now already working on version 3 of them. So in 25 years, we've gone through three full versions. So as that thing happened, my life followed, right? So it wrote the book, created the initiative office with full support from President Clinton and others there that were there to get the funding that we would need to get that office off the ground. And then from there, I decided, okay, I know what's next is not just web, but software. So I want to create a company that would be basically a company of experts and professionals that would help other companies and other organizations build and deliver accessible web and accessible software application. So that led me to creating my own company called TPG or
Mm-hmm.
Paciello Group, right?
Yeah.
And we did that for 15, 16 years. And it became the model because of all of the team, all of the folks that worked with me, worked for me, but really worked with me. We're all colleagues and friends. We just built this massive group of just incredible humans, incredible friends, many with disabilities themselves, others not, but many had family members with disabilities. But the thing was, we had the same common passion, and that was to make the web and make software usable and accessible for people with disabilities, one of the underserved populations. And TPG became a market name, a market brand, till I sold it.
No doubt. No doubt. And now I know you are doing all sorts of wonderful things as the chief accessibility officer at AudioEye. So how is AudioEye making strides in digital accessibility, and tell me what excites you about your work there?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question because it was a massive and really challenging job. I actually been retired for several years and just playing off in the background, doing little things, making myself available, acting more as a mentor more than anything to friends. But there's a big challenge out there today in accessibility, and as you are aware, more than 250,000 websites are being built every day,
Mm-hmm.
and over 95% of them are not accessible. They don't meet those accessibility guidelines. This is a result of data that has been collected and then distributed by an organization called WebAIM. And they've been producing these reports year after year that basically say that the home pages, never mind the web or the web applications, of the 1 million websites that they analyze and survey each year, 96% of them are not accessible.
Oh, wow.
And yet I know that there are thousands, we may be reaching tens of thousands now, of professionals in the field who are working really hard with the tools that they have and the expertise that they have to try to help these companies and these organizations make their sites accessible. Here's the problem, and this is one of the reasons why I decided to make this leap. We can't scale.
Yeah.
We cannot keep up with that mass production, as it were, of those web entities. And yet, the digital society that we live in today is now the new brick and mortar. It's replaced it for all intents and purposes. This is where people shop. This is where people do their government services, file their taxes. Everything and anything you could think of at any level has been digitized in one form or another. This show, right? We're not doing radio anymore. We're not doing standard television anymore. Everything is through video streaming and whatnot. So it's a very different world. And for accessibility, we can't scale.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of thoughts about how do we make this happen. One way that we tried to tackle was from the top down. Try to get the C-level folks to invest into their credit companies like a Microsoft or Adobe and Amazon, companies like that. They have made those kind of investments. But their products today, still by and large, have issues with accessibility. And they're just a few, right? We're not even talking about the Fortune 100, right? We're talking about the Fortune 5, maybe.
Yeah.
So how do we scale?
And I guess the first thing that comes to mind when you talk about scale is now you throw in artificial intelligence. Let's pause for a moment. We'll be right back. The speed at which we are maximizing the capacity
I think there is a statistic out there that says artificial intelligence is doubling in content capacity every 2 months right now.
I'm surprised it's that long. Frankly, I'm watching things being produced, mass produced again by AI.
Yeah.
But I'm glad you talked about because you asked me what was it that brought me to AudioEye. So AudioEye are experts in AI and automation.
Okay.
That was the cue for me. Now, there's some other reasons why I got involved that have more to do with the industry itself. But the fact of the matter was I saw we needed to scale. I saw their advances of what they were working on in AI. I saw what they were doing already with automation. Okay. Realizing that this is all a work in progress, right? So you never get it right the first time, to quote a Billy Joel phrase, right? But I knew there's a lot of work. I knew there were dedicated people. So let's get the AI, let's get the automation, and then we integrate that into getting experts testing, still doing the testing, providing the consultation that clients would need, and most importantly, because this is a real critical aspect of making sure, is this thing usable and accessible, was involving individuals with disabilities as part of that development process, that remediation process that we're doing. So that's what we do. We do automated remediation, and we're experts at it. We're good at it. The company's got 126,000 clients right now to speak to, and we've got a lot more work to do. I think all of us will admit that. Slowly but surely, we're getting better. But that's the way things happen with technology, right? You break it out. AI itself has been around for 30, 40 years, as far as I know, probably more than that, as far as I know. But it's only been the last year or so that we're starting to figure out how do we use it and how does it make life better for us in a lot of different ways.
And you bring up such great points, because I think when you think about AI and how it's changing the landscape, we all know that the work that you're talking about with respect to accessibility doesn't just focus on people with different abilities. It helps everyone, right? And so when you think about the changing landscape of data, and you referenced whether we're talking about video or other aspects, how do you think AI is changing the landscape when it comes to to digital accessibility?
Yeah. So
Aside from
one,
scale.
right, exactly right. Aside from the scale, so for one, we can produce information faster. We can produce data faster, right? Can we view quantified and qualified data, though? What is the trustfulness or trustworthiness of that data? So that's a big thing, okay? It's a big thing for people with disabilities because they already are behind the eight ball, so to speak, in terms of how they even can get that information to themselves, rendered through whatever technology that they may be using. So AI has the potential of training it, right? That's a dev is training it. It's more, I think it's still more machine learning than it is really true artificial intelligence. But at that level,
and I agree with you.
yeah, and it gets better. It will get better with time. So I believe that is one way that AI will help advance. It'll get information that is trustworthy, quicker, and more on a wide scale to people with disabilities. Here's another way that AI is being used. There is an application out there, this is just a for instance, called Be My Eyes. So AI is being used to act as an interpreter, a visual interpreter in this case for the blind, with the aid of other humans. So you still have human assistance, but AI is making it possible for more blind people to have a new type of assistive technology or adaptive technology. I believe ultimately that where this all will go, and I'm writing a couple of blogs on this right now, as a matter of fact, is that we will be able to achieve something that I did write in my book 25 years ago. And that is this notion of pervasive accessibility. So what do I mean by that? Pervasive meaning widespread. Everyone everywhere has it. But here's the thing. Today, a person with a disability has to use assistive or adaptive technology in order to interact with their computer system, and then the browser, and then the web, and then you see how that layer goes just like that? They need that. They shouldn't have to. I want to create a system, and I believe AI will be able to help us do that, where the system or the interface adapts to the user. You don't need AT anymore, because on the other side, that artificial intelligence is providing you what you need in the same time that you get it.
Wow.
So that's the time accessibility.
Yeah, that's awesome. So then, with that in mind, knowing that there is this wonderful opportunity that exists, maybe you can tell me, are there ways that businesses and governments can collaborate to ensure digital accessibility? Because one of the things, my background is all about data exchange. That's where I lived in information products. But the work that I'm doing specifically for the Data Institute today really focuses on public private people partnerships and really making sure that when it could be something as simple as a municipality is throwing up a sensor on a traffic light and nobody really knows what data is being collected, where it's going, who has access to it. There's a whole lot of other information and
Sure.
guidelines that need to go into it. But specifically, as we talk about digital accessibility, I would love to hear your thoughts on how business and government can collaborate.
Yeah, so there are efforts already in place. There have been a number of different things that have been going on. One of those is something that I worked on, and I felt like this was. Let's be fair. The W3C through its Office of Web Accessibility Initiative is really a combination of international governments and private public organizations that are involved. So you've got all the Fortune 1000 companies that are all there all over the world, and you've got government that's heavily involved. So there's a collaboration that is working, and they build working groups and they work around it. There's also other organizations like the G3ICT, which is a UN started organization that also has a focus of bringing government and private sector businesses together. So some of these things actually already exist. The fact is, when I co-chaired the last federal advisory committee for back in the early to mid 2000s, the Section 508 committee. It actually, we took in two government standards: Section 508, which is the information communication and accessibility standard for procurement in the federal government, along with the Telecommunications Act, which is Section 255 of the Rehab Act. That was a collection of U.S. federal, U.S. state, international governments and businesses together, working together. And they were the ones that ultimately produced that new standard, which is the high watermark for where state governments in the US, for example, now model their efforts. So this is a very long way of saying those organizations, those collaborations do exist, but there aren't enough of them. There are not enough of them. I'd love to see what the Data Institute is doing, for example, to make things happen at that level. Let me give you a good reason why I think this is so important. I recently just came out of a series of conversations with the state of California this past end of summer, going into their new fiscal year. And we were working on a new state mandate for accessibility called Cal 1757. And long story short, it didn't pass. Didn't get to the governor's desk because they just felt like there was more work that needed to be done. And we couldn't get, frankly speaking, state government and private sector companies on the same page to get those mandates together, to talk things through. And so that was I was disappointed because it had the opportunity, it still does, to be the first of its kind in terms of a state standard and state mandate. But again, that's where the collaboration has to work. I see a lot of this, frankly, people being somewhat in organizations being self-serving. So what's in it for me, right? Instead of really what the principle of let's do the right thing for others. Let's make this happen. Why shouldn't an individual with a disability be able to have the same digital access rights that a person like myself without a disability has, right? So there are more opportunities for that to happen. There are a number of organizations worldwide, national, international, that are trying to work in that vein. Let's see what happens. Let's see what the next few years brings about.
Awesome. And I think it's great that they exist. I think there's, to your point, there's probably not enough of them, which is why we see so many different gaps that exist today, whether it come to internet accessibility itself or otherwise. Um, so can you talk a little bit about, like, what's your thought process when it comes to this whole conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion? And we see a lot of companies stepping back and not focusing there and all of those things. How do you think that's going to impact where we are when it comes to digital accessibility? Or do you have any advice, thoughts, guidance as we move forward?
Yeah, I wish I had the silver bullet for how this is going to happen. It's funny, I've been seeing this coming, to be honest with you. I was working for a company a couple of years ago and was hired by their chief DE&I officer to come in and eventually take on a role similar to what I have here with AudioEye. This was a very large Fortune 500 company that asked me to come in and do that. And they killed that role. They decided, right? And I saw the handwriting on the wall. This is coming. I really wanted to go in that direction. Now we're starting to see everybody, right? Walmart just made their big announcement a couple of days ago. And I keep wondering, well, who's next? Melyssa, this is a great question. A couple of colleagues of mine just literally had this kind of closed door discussion. What are we going to do? How are we going to do this? This was supposed to be the new path for embracing disability, never mind diversity and equity and inclusion, right? This was a big thing. In fact, the US federal government called it DEI and A to make sure that they included the accessibility part of it. Where are we going to go? At heart, at root, I'm a technologist, and so are my friends. We have decided, whether this will work or not, I don't know. But we have decided that technology is the path by which we will attack this kind of new wall, new barrier that we have. I don't typically get involved in the government and the politics and the social aspects of things like that, because even though I am working in the field of disabilities, I am a technologist. And I feel like we could solve this problem by feeding into the very heart of why these offices, as I see it, these organizations are going away. Disability in digital accessibility particularly has always been around compliance. Compliance has always been viewed by organizations, for profit and nonprofit, as a cost of doing business. So we got to tackle that problem. Take away the cost factor. And the way that we take away that cost factor, that conversation, is by making the technology better than where it's at today. And I think we can do that. To what you were saying before, I think AI and I think automation can be big differentiators in this world. So if we tackle those things, make them work, and make them work well, not just good, to again tackle, quote Jim Collins' notion, I don't want to be good, I want to be great. Now, me personally, I want this solution to be great, and I wanted to accomplish that pervasive accessibility that I talked about. And I think it can be done. And there are already hints in the industry of seeing things like this already take place. So that's my approach. That's how a few of my friends, I think that's how we're going to solve it. Others, much smarter than me and much younger. I hope
You strike me as having quite a bit of energy. So I don't know. You said you were retired, but I don't know. So then how do you think individuals can contribute to advancing accessibility within their own spheres of influence? Because I think, as companies may step back and as you focus on technological advances, which there are lots going on, and especially when we think about connectivity and the Internet of Things and all of those things, what can individuals do to contribute?
Yeah, you talked earlier about leadership and being someone who folks follow. So first and foremost, it's got to be passion. Anything worth working on and working hard for starts at the heart, right? And you got to have that passion for it. So if there are individuals who are working in a large organization or a small organization, if you've got that passion, right? Then after that, it's a matter of dedicating yourself. Start talking about it. Start getting involved. Start volunteering. Go to events and conferences. They're all over the world. It doesn't matter whether you're here in the US, in Europe, Asia, Australia, South America, anywhere, Canada, they're everywhere, right? Get involved with some of those organizations. Start talking about it. Ask questions. If you're not sure what the answers are, ask questions. Get involved with people with disabilities in the constituency organizations that support them and figure out how you can get involved, how you can help. That's how I got started, to be honest with you. We go back to that first story. It was because I saw something amongst the blind and I thought, hey, how do I do this? I just started emailing. I started looking up. I started attending conferences. I started speaking at conferences. And my talks back then were more questions than they were answers, right? Now, today, it's a little bit of 50-50. That's how you do it. Get involved. Any great venture starts with first getting involved. Get involved with the constituency. People with disabilities, they are an amazing, amazing community. I've never met an individual, no matter how profound that disability might be, that wasn't passionate about making things work and work right, not just for themselves, but for others. So that's what I would embrace. That's what I would embrace.
Well, that's great. I think, and looking back on your all of the efforts that you've been putting into it for decades now, are there, maybe you can talk about some, maybe a particular success that you felt achieved? I know one of my friends, Gail Burgos, I'll give her a shout out. She's always talking about the head, heart, and hands and how they connect, because once you have a heart, you can actually use your hands to do all sorts of things and get involved. So I appreciate the fact that it's like, hey, get in here, ask questions, do something. Are there particular successes that you look back on and are particularly proud of, or maybe one that you see in the future that you want to achieve?
Yeah, like I said, I've been very fortunate. Writing the first book on the topic, creating this international committee for achieving a very small standard. Those are feathers in my cap. The Web Accessibility Initiative. I created the first ever industry commercialized version of a DVD and CD-ROM that was fully accessible. So I've got all these little things around TPG, the company itself. I would bet anyone, for all the money in the world, no one could build a company with the great kind of people that and friends and colleagues that I had on that team. I put them up against anyone. They were that great. They are that great. They're still out there working. Most of them are working for other companies now. But so I consider those things great. But I will tell you what I think is my greatest accomplishment. It's probably one that most people wouldn't think about. And the two people that I'm about to mention probably won't even think about it, aren't even thinking about it. There's that old notion of Stephen Covey, to learn, to live, to love, to leave a legacy.
Mhm.
And I have two sons that work for competitors of AudioEye, but are in this industry and are wholly devoted. Shane, my oldest son, works for Level Access, a big accessibility company based in, I think they're actually headquartered down in California. And then my youngest son, Kyle, works for DQ, which is another one of the large accessibility companies. But I've reached that point in my life now where I could say I could pass off my legacy to them, and they're carrying on some of the work that I've done. And I hope that they'll do bigger and better things than I have. But I think I see that as my greatest accomplishment, that I could give that gift to my friends and colleagues in the world.
Oh, that's awesome. What a way to end this podcast. I can't even think, you're like going to bring me to tears. Like, how awesome is that when you see your legacy already in place? And like I said, you still have a lot of energy. So I don't get the impression that you're going to stop anytime soon. But it's wonderful to know that you have your kids that are really taking the flag and continuing to move it forward. Congratulations to you, because I know there's a lot of parents out there that don't have that story. And
Yeah.
so it's awesome that when you see that kind of influence continue generationally, congratulations to you and your family.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
With that, I cannot wait to have some additional conversations with you in the future. And I look forward to it. And thank you so much for joining me for this episode of the Jali Podcast. And hopefully we can circle back and maybe have another one in the future.
It was my privilege and my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on, Melyssa.
Thanks for joining me on the Jali Podcast. Please subscribe so you won't miss an episode. See you next week.